Hello, I'm Shannon Taylor, the Executive Director of The Conversation, from Blacks and Jews in Conversation. And we have two guests on you'll hear from momentarily. One is, as you can see on the screen, Dr. Sebastian Lighvani. Yes, it's a real name. It's a gentleman who came from England, came to America. He's a specialist in allergy and internal medicine. And the other is an author, Michael Skakun, and he'll tell you about his father, who masqueraded first as a Polish Catholic, and would I had those looks, and then as a SS officer. And those looks I can do without. But he managed to survive the war with both of those identities intact and walk away from it all. And the author is of the book On Burning Ground. And only The Conversation can bring you two guests completely disparate from each other, never met before, may never see each other again, with this type of portfolio from each, and yet there they are, and we're going to continue the conversation with them both simultaneously. First, let me tell you about Dr. Lighvani, if I can get these credentials correct, because medicine and I never got along.
Just embellish, Shannon.
He's board certified in allergy, immunology, and internal medicine. He got his medical school training at King's College in England. The King and I have nothing in common, although I happen to have toured the institution.
You do look like him, though.
Enough from you in the background there. He graduated in 1995 and moved to the United States. And then he got a specialty in internal medicine in no less than the Mayo Clinic. He didn't start in anything small, and that is in Minnesota. His subspecialty is in allergy, immunology, education at Johns Hopkins University. Well, it figures if you start with the Mayo Clinic, you're going to go on to Johns Hopkins. You're not going to go and go to Podunk. And his general practice is in New York City, and in a few weeks he will be an assistant clinical professor of allergy at New York Hospital, Cornell, and he is an attending physician at Lenox Hill. Michael Skakun, the author of On Burning Ground, was able to write about his father, something I've tried for decades but unable. Instead, I had my father lecture at various colleges and high schools and other institutions, and they both met at Stuyvesant High School for Jewish History Month. And my father was in the underground, and then in the American Army, and then on the first boat out of there to Israel to fight in the Liberation War. And Michael's father managed to steer throughout the war in various identities without ever having to shoot anybody. And I don't know how he didn't shoot anybody and still maintain his identities as Polish Catholics and as SS officers and merged from one. He should have been a spy. That's clearly where he should have. CIA was looking for this guy and couldn't find him. So now I'm going to turn first to Michael and ask him to tell you how he enjoyed his time with all the students we had at Stuyvesant High School and how he came to write the book.
Well, I had the privilege and the pleasure of being at Stuyvesant High School, thanks to Shannon's invitation, and I was very pleased to meet his father, whose tale of survival is extraordinary in and of itself. I recounted my father's story, how he was able, as a very young man in desperate times, to recast himself completely, to become a kind of chameleon and assume various identities, first as a Christian, then as a Muslim, and finally, at the end of his tether, as a Waffen-SS recruit. And I feel that the students reacted intelligently. They obviously had never heard a story of this kind, and yet they listened with great attentiveness, and they asked intelligent questions. We also spoke a little bit about the Middle East, and there things were a little more heated and more controversial. But I was glad to be there because obviously Stuyvesant, one of the best schools in the United States, has an interesting array of students. They're bright, they're keen, they're inquiring, more or less, and they are a wonderful cast of characters.
Now, tell me what inspired you to write the book?
Well, you know, the Holocaust, as we have now come to understand, was the most horrifying event certainly in modern history, if not in human history. And it's been told, it's been recounted many times, but I felt that my father's story was one that really needed to be spoken about in a unique way, because he was able, through, as I mentioned, desperate cunning, unbelievable psychological stamina, and sheer desperation to concoct a new identity, to marry various ethnic profiles and create a new self. And I was interested to know how this young man, who was an only child, who was a rabbinical student, who was steeped in moral piety, was able to find within himself these kinds of psychic resources to overcome the most terrifying destiny in Europe. And so this story of psychological desperation and ethnic cleverness, an ability to meld identities, was so unique that it tickled my imagination and intrigued my mind, and ultimately led me to pen and paper.
Dr. Lighvani, what inspired you to become a doctor, and why the fields that you chose?
Well, that's a great question, Shannon, and it probably needs to delve back to kind of my childhood. You know, my parents, from a very young age, stressed that education was very important, and you know, they, be it from close or from afar, have always kind of managed to kind of like point us in the right direction. When I was in England in boarding school, they kind of like supervised me quite nicely in terms of picking the subjects that would lead me towards medicine. And ultimately, you know, I entered medical school in England at 18. And, you know, at that point, I think I was certainly young enough to worry more about my hairstyle than, you know, what I wanted to do as a vocation. But it certainly was a good introduction. And, you know, I went into medical school at 18 and graduated at 23. And by then, as I said, I gradually started growing into medicine as a field, and I really began to enjoy it for what it is, which is really an art and a science. Having completed my medical education in England, my mother at that point and father, who both lived in the United States, kind of nicely ushered me to come to the States and live a bit closer to home. So I kindly, like a good son, obliged and came to the United States. When I was here, I decided to pursue a residency in internal medicine because I thought that would give me the most broad kind of background in medicine. And so I elected to do it at the Mayo Clinic because the weather was so lovely over there. And so I spent 3 years of my life in Minnesota between 1981 and 2001. And subsequent to that, as you pointed out, decided to do a specialty fellowship in allergy immunology, and trekked across to the East Coast of the United States and went to Baltimore, where I was at Johns Hopkins. That was about 2 years, and after that came to New York.
Do you foresee yourself, doctor, writing books on allergies? People know, I imagine, or they shouldn't listen to the show, what an allergy is. But do you expect that you'll be going into your particular fields in terms of the internal medicine and the progression of allergies, this being the worst year, and last year being the worst year up till then, and the year then, and so on and so forth?
I mean, you're right. I mean, first of all, if you look at the statistics, allergy is just becoming, it's kind of a buzzword now. Pretty much everyone has it on the tip of their tongue. You know, if you ask people in the street, either they know someone who has an allergy, they have a child who has an allergy. Peanut allergies, you can't go to schools and eat peanut butter. The most American of all foods is just banned from schools. It's like, I don't really know how the peanut butter industry is really surviving, but really there is an allergy epidemic in this country. And if you look at the statistics, you know, the World Health Organization has shown that there's been, you know, over a doubling or a tripling of the incidence of allergies over the last 3 or 4 decades. If you look at the incidence of allergy in children, right now there was a study that came out from Fernando Martinez's group in Tucson, Arizona. They looked at it. Up to 40 out of 100 kids are sensitive to some kind of an environmental allergen. That's unheard of. I mean, these are the kids that are going to be the allergy sufferers of tomorrow. And you know, you add on top of that, as you said, the fact that, you know, we're getting these bumper years of allergy. And, you know, why is that? Probably global warming has something to do with it. You know, certainly the changes in our climate mean that we might have shorter winters and longer spring pollution. Certainly there's other factors such as the planting of male trees in the city. You know, most people don't even know that there's a difference between male and female trees, but there are. So because they are cheaper to look after and they don't produce a lot of litter, which is a first for men, they're planted around the city, but they are prolific pollen producers. So, you know, when you combine all those, you really do get this kind of tremendous kind of increase in incidence of allergies.
I have a question for both of you. In the war, the Second World War, there really was no great concentration of thought on allergy. And they had this humongous loss of population and transportation of population and amount of refugees. And since then, we hear more and more about allergies, most importantly in our last decade. Now, do you think that the wars that have taken place in the last century had an effect on the environmental health and on the ecosystems? Does war act to enhance environmental destruction? Does it act to impede it? What are your thoughts?
That's a very interesting question, Shannon. I mean, I think if you look at it, certainly war has geopolitical impact, and certainly it can make a big difference from the standpoint of war impacts lifestyles. And I think going back, I think it's very apt that you talk about the wars, because some of the studies looking at the incidence of allergies that are kind of like growing looked specifically at the incidence of allergies in East and West Berlin, which as a group were very similar before the Berlin Wall came up. And after the Berlin Wall came down, there was a study done by Rebecca von Mutius, who's a German scientist, that specifically looked at the incidence of allergies in that area. The incidence of allergies in West Berlin was up here, about similar to what we have in the United States. The incidence of allergies in East Berlin was down here. Once the Berlin Wall came down and David Hasselhoff was invited to sing on top of the Berlin Wall, the incidence of allergies in East Berlin climbed through the roof. And that was within a matter of 10 or 15 years. So it certainly raises the issue that, there must be something in the lifestyle that we have, be it the super hygienic Western lifestyle, that certainly allows us to kind of express these allergic genes. As I said, the East and West Berliners are the same group of people, separated by a wall, and now, with the Berlin Wall coming down, you're getting this shift. So war, yes, by the way that it impacts the way we live, certainly impacts, how genetics may be manifested. So it's a great point, Shannon.
Michael?
Yes, well, obviously war does impact the ecology, both the personal ecology of the human being, obviously, and the larger ecology of the planet. The level of destructiveness that World War II wrought was unbelievable. The bombings, the destruction of plant life, of human life. I mean, the range of devastation was really incalculable. The interesting thing, I think, is that during the war, especially for people who were under tremendous pressure, sometimes their health held up only till the end of the war, when suddenly they felt the cumulative pressures come to a head. So that in the concentration camps, you find that few people committed suicide, that the will to live and the longing to survive was so strong that it, in some ways, was a kind of suppressor of disease. But of course, after the war, many people began to develop symptoms which they couldn't afford to suffer from during the war, because the great focus was on survival. But there's no question that the spread of war, and we have so many, so to speak, small wars, creates an environment in which human habitation becomes increasingly more difficult.
Michael, tell me the worst incident, the closest that your father came to getting captured, that you've written about in your book.
Well, my father had very, very many close calls, but the one that really is the linchpin to this story is in 1943, or rather 1944, after spending about a year and a half on a Nazi farm with many other Polish and Russian laborers, somebody began to suspect that he might not be who he is. He didn't think that my father was a Jew necessarily, but he thought that my father was posing as a Catholic and as a Muslim, and had so many different identities and so many different linguistic abilities. He said to another laborer, this man, Stefan, which was my father's assumed name, only the devil knows who he really is. And when my father overheard this suspicious aspersion cast on him, he became so terrified that he would be revealed, and of course being revealed would mean not only death, but it would mean horrendous torture, that he decided to go from the frying pan into the fire, and he decided to take the ultimate gamble, to enter the Waffen-SS And this was the most terrifying moment. It was a moment of great moral desperation and psychological extremity. So of all the difficult moments, the moment when he entered the Waffen-SS, the most terrifying of all the military units that Hitler had, and precisely the people who killed his own mother and destroyed 5,000 people in his hometown in 1941 and went on to kill 6 million Jews and millions of others, was a moment that was one of the great crossroads of his life. And the ability to retain his sanity at this point was really extraordinary.
If we think about Stalin imprisoning 25 million people in the gulags throughout the 30s and 40s, and then 50 to 60 million getting killed in the war years when he would just throw the bodies at the Hitler machine. And we think about another 50 million getting killed from the war, including the Germans. There was around the world besides, there was a huge loss of population at that time period. Now, throughout this whole period, there were lessons to be learned. Have we learned those lessons today, whether in medicine, or whether in history, whether in geopolitics? Do either of you see that we have learned it correctly, are applying it correctly, or are we just reaping the same mistakes all over again and calling the wrong people Hitlers and the wrong people Churchills and the wrong people Roosevelts?
It's looking at it from my standpoint, clearly is that our foreign policy is great right now, since everything seems to be going so well around the world. The reality is that if you look at it analytically, I don't think we really learn a lot of the lessons, and oftentimes, it's very human nature to repeat the mistakes that you make. And unfortunately, when you look at it on a macro level, because one group of people make the mistake and then the new group comes along and they haven't learned the mistakes the old people have, oftentimes the same mistakes are repeated because, it's a new generation and they don't read their history books very well, and they don't pay attention to the old lessons. And so I think, when you do talk about your father and, situations that exemplify what previous generations have gone through, there's a really valid and sage lesson to be learned in that there is a lot that's happened throughout history, and oftentimes, if we pay attention to those things, oftentimes we don't need to make the same mistakes. Unfortunately, I don't think all the politicians that, we have out there really pay attention to this stuff. And, they're more concerned about getting elected than they are about the reality of what actually makes a difference for people.
Michael?
Well, unfortunately, the human animal is very resistant to rationality, and we haven't really learned the lessons of the past. Obviously, we see so many different tragedies going on currently. After the Holocaust, many people thought that this would be such a terrifying lesson that surely no other tragedy of this kind would ever happen again. And yet we see throughout the last 50 to 60 years many genocides occurring on various continents. It bespeaks something about the recalcitrance of the human being who cannot or will not learn the lessons of the past. However, I think there is an attempt through international bodies and through men of goodwill to try to bring a different kind of reality to bear. But we have learned in the bitter way that the Holocaust that it has cast such a dark and long shadow on humanity that it will take centuries, if not millennia, before we can even come to grips with its true dimensions.
Notice I didn't give my opinion on anything here. I didn't identify anything. I'm being very catty here. So I'm going to give a quick question to the doctor. I am terribly allergic, and this is not an invitation, to carrots in their raw form. Why am I not allergic? And also to carrot juice. Why am I not allergic right off the bat to carrot cake?
That's a great question. And I'd just like to point out that Shannon is actually one of my patients, so he's excusing me of all HIPAA violations here, ladies and gentlemen, so you can't sue me now, Shannon, all right? In general, I mean, you do get sensitivity as someone who's allergic to foods to, you know, the structural proteins that you're allergic to. For example, if you're allergic to carrot, there may be a specific protein in the carrot that you're reacting to. In the case of people who are allergic to fresh fruits or fresh vegetables but don't seem to react to the cooked form of it, for example, people who suffer from hay fever and can't eat fresh apples, people who can't eat cherries, the same people, if you ask them, well, I bet you eat a cherry pie or an apple pie, they're like, absolutely, I eat it every night. And, you know, I've got the waste to prove it. And the reason is that that protein moiety, which is basically recognized by your immune system, is heat labile, i.e. it's broken down by heat, and oftentimes it's broken down by the stomach acids. So oftentimes when you just touch a fresh fruit to your mouth or lip, it triggers a reaction because it's recognized by the body's allergic cells in the skin. However, if you cook it, that protein structure has changed, and now essentially the body just doesn't recognize it anymore, and oftentimes, you know, you don't get the reaction. So, you know, in your case, a fresh, you know, glass of carrot juice or fresh carrot will certainly trigger those reactions, but carrot cake, even though it's bad for your waistline, won't trigger any allergic reactions.
Now, what about these stupid things that they thrust in your face everywhere you go, these ionic breezes and the other breezes and all kinds of breezes? I'm not advertising any kind of purchase, or I'm not advising against purchasing. I'm
Good.
not commenting one way or the other.
Good.
I just want to know, are air purifiers helpful? They help me at certain times of the year. Are there certain times of the year you really should use them? Certain times of the year you should avoid them? What is their whole basic understanding here, without regard to any particular make or model? The ionosphere is involved. I understand. What is the purpose?
That's, you know, absolutely. I don't want to have any of the manufacturers attack me after I leave this studio.
No, we're non-commercial, so
Okay,
we're not addressing
fantastic.
it to any.
All right, and I'm not going
principle
to.
of these humidifiers
Very good,
that
right.
have been born out of Godzilla.
Sure. So let's take the specific cases. For example, the ionic breezes that you see advertised in a lot of the conventional shops. You know, there's been a number of studies looking at their efficacy. That's how effective they are at reducing allergies, and even Consumer Reports and guidelines have looked at this, and unfortunately they all get the thumbs down, i.e. they're not very effective. Nevertheless, they seem to advertise very prolifically and oftentimes have the labels of a supporting allergy foundation who usually they've paid to support them. And so in reality, I think, you know, whether you are an allergy sufferer or not, it behooves you to do a bit of background research before you spend your well hard-earned money on some of these devices. Now, there are some devices called HEPA filters, and they're probably a lot more effective at reducing the content of allergy in the environment. But again, it depends on the exposure. If you have a cat in the bedroom and you put a HEPA filter in there, you're not really going to relieve much of the allergy when the cat sits on your pillow and sleeps next to your face every night. So, you know, it's all relative. So, you know, ultimately what I would say is I don't want to bash any specific products, but I would really recommend for patients to go out there. You know, if a product costs $300, $400, $500, why don't you just sit down and talk to your physician and see if it's worth spending that money?
Now, Michael, I've got into these inventions because Nazis were given credit for a lot of inventions, with our space program, with rockets, of course, but with all kinds of other incidental inventions. They were known torturers in the medical field. Mengele is the name that most prominently stands out. But they considered themselves eugenists, and they got that from America with what was done to the black population and to a population of people who were mentally afflicted. And Hitler imported the philosophy wholesale to all kinds of terrible effects. But what about their experiments with gas? What about their experiments in the concentration camps? They never just isolated it to murder. They believed that they could prove master superiority and racial characteristics. And we're all familiar with Hitler walking out on Jesse Owens after he won the Olympics, but the Jews couldn't even compete. What did they do with all of their technology? Did your father come across any of this during the time that he was hiding?
Well, obviously he came across so much of what many other people confronted. German science was probably in the 1920s and in the very early 1930s the most advanced in Europe. The great paradox is that this nation, which was perhaps the most sophisticated in Europe, it was called the nation of Dichter and Richter, in the sense it was a nation of judges and poets, ended up becoming a nation of executioners. And how did that happen? How did the Germans take the products of rationality, such as medicine and science and technology, and utilize it for a morally depraved purpose? And this is the paradox that we keep on confronting all the time. How can the nation of Beethoven, Bach, Brahms, and the great scientists, and because the Germans had so many Nobel Prize winners, many of whom were Jews, how could they have descended to such a level of barbarity, and how could they have bastardized rationality to the point of using it for the most irrational purposes? And this is one of those philosophical conundrums that we have really no answer for. And the more we study it, the less we seem to be able to understand it. But I think that we will always be puzzled by human character and its potential.
I just interject here because I think you raise a valid point. How is it that humanity can sink to the lows that it does, and how can the masses do this? And I think there's actually studies in psychology looking at this specific fact, and oftentimes the masses are very easy to lead one way or the other, and what it needs is a few people at the pinnacles usually to lead the way, and there is a certain sense of groupthink.
Yes.
And an inability to question anything, even if it goes against your rationale or moral judgment.
Well, the great tragedy of our time is that the elites often orchestrate these horrible things, so that the German scientists, the biologists, the doctors,
Right.
unfortunately, were often at the helm of exploiting science for inhuman purposes. And whether it was a philosopher like Heidegger, or whether it was a doctor like Mengele, or other physicians who were totally diabolical, it really puts into question the whole Enlightenment project, which began in the 18th century with the hope of creating a linear progress. And we now realize that science is not always a forward-looking proposition.
Well, you see, you started out totally different fields, and you end up right off the cuff in a conversation on the same theme, using your mutual expertise. I want to thank you both for coming. This has been from not just Blacks and Jews in Conversation, Dr. Sebastian Lighvani and Michael Skakun, author of On Burning Ground. You can catch them out in the environs of our wonderful city, and we look forward to having you back at any time. Thank you.